The Niagara movement was one of the first organizations, one of the first movements that was explicitly centered around an unequivocal demand for African American civil rights and full inclusion into the American body politic.
The problem with the 20th century is the problem of the color line. W.E.B. Du Bois. Why did W.E.B. Du Bois think it was imperative to get equal rights now? In his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, he laid out why gaining equal rights was necessary for Black Americans, the psychology behind this belief, and why any other idea that didn't include political and civil rights for Black Americans immediately was downright dangerous. Let's explore and break down why this book and Du Bois' philosophy continues to encourage debates and fuel movements more than 100 years after it was published. If you like Black history, make sure you subscribe, like, and share. The year was 1895. As the century was coming to a close, Black America was struggling to find an identity as they slowly began to build after centuries of being deprived by way of chattel slavery. There were pockets of Black progression, small communities living throughout the country, but the threat of white retribution was always looming. The promises and progress of the Reconstruction era had been dismantled and replaced by the Jim Crow era. But one man still believed and wanted to encourage Black people to continue to fight, demand for their rights, and integrate into this society that seemed very resistant to the idea. W.E.B. Du Bois believed Black Americans were owed civil rights, political rights, and the right to move freely throughout the country, and he believed it was beholden on the white people to relinquish their racist grips. He laid out his thoughts in 1903 when The Souls of Black Folk was published. Let's explore some of those key concepts. Articulation of the Black American experience. A major point that Du Bois focused on was the uniqueness of the Black experience in America. He articulated the pain and aspirations of African Americans during the time of systemic racism and oppression. W.E.B. Du Bois came from a very unique experience for Black Americans during his time. He was not born into slavery. As a matter of fact, neither were his parents or grandparents. Du Bois came from a Black family that had been free for several generations. He was also raised in Massachusetts, a free state, where he never experienced overt racism or segregation. Du Bois' only interactions with white people were mostly positive and supportive. Even still, he was often the only Black child in his classes. Du Bois didn't experience violent outward racism until he went to college at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It was there for the first time that he experienced being in an all-Black classroom. It wasn't until college that he saw the segregation of Blacks and whites and the degradation and impoverished conditions that Black Americans lived in the South. His experience at Fisk was transformational. Du Bois didn't grow up experiencing the harsh realities that so many Southern Black Americans experienced. Seeing the harmful remnants of slavery and the current laws of Jim Crow made him realize change was needed immediately. Du Bois believed that there needed to be a recognition of these harmful conditions by those he believed caused them. He believed legislation and policies would need to be enacted to ensure the safety and well-being of Black Americans. He also believed that there were good and righteous white Americans and that they needed to make space for Black Americans. Du Bois went to college because of the support of his white neighbors. He had spent time studying in Germany and came away with the realization that peace among races was possible. Du Bois went on to become the first Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard. These opportunities were available to Black Americans. He just believed that the gatekeepers needed to stop blocking the path. The double consciousness. Du Bois continued his theme of the complexities of navigating America as a Black American when he introduced the idea of double consciousness. He wrote of the internal conflict experienced by African Americans who have to navigate their identity as both Black and American in a society that devalues them. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, by measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Du Bois experienced this peculiar sensation. He himself was an excellent scholar, the first to get a PhD from Harvard, but was still not allowed at certain lunch counters because of his skin color. This concept can speak to Muhammad Ali famously winning a gold medal in 1960 in Rome, but was still discriminated against when he came back home to America, or the countless Blacks who fought in America's wars only to be denied equal rights. The constant battle of being a proud American, but also treated unfairly by the same country, all because of their skin color. The double consciousness reflects the conflict of being Black and American in a society that marginalizes Black identity, causing a constant tension between personal identity and societal perception. The veil. The Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. DuBois' experiences led him to believe that Black Americans were viewed through a barrier that obscured their true potential. That veil was constructed by centuries of slavery, racism, and oppression that led to Black Americans constantly being viewed as incapable and unworthy by their American counterparts. The veil symbolized a misunderstanding between Black and white Americans. DuBois wanted to encourage the dismantling of this veil so that white Americans could see the true potential and humanity of Black individuals. This dismantling, he believed, would need to come through civil rights, legislation, and political reform. DuBois versus Washington. In 1895, as DuBois was finishing up his studies at Harvard, a lightning rod of an opposing philosophy struck the Black American community. It was a speech delivered by Booker T. Washington that we now refer to as the Atlanta Compromise. It was during this speech Washington advocated to maintain segregation in exchange for Black solidarity. Washington believed Black Americans should not seek out integration or civil rights, at least not right now. Instead, he advocated for vocational training to lean into the centuries of forced education in agriculture and put all efforts to build the Black community into a formidable group first. Washington wanted Black people to earn the respect of white Americans, not agitate or force their acceptance. Booker T. Washington pushed the idea of gradualism. The Atlanta Compromise speech made Booker T. Washington one of the most famous men in America. His message resonated with a lot of Black Americans, but was also weaponized by oppressive white agendas. DuBois responded in his book, "Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission, but adjustment at such a peculiar time as to make his program unique." DuBois critiques Booker T. Washington's accommodationist stance. He believed Black Americans couldn't afford to take things slow, not when Black Americans were victims of racial violence and disenfranchisement. DuBois believed Washington's approach compromised the progress into full civil rights and stifled political activism, in exchange for a future that DuBois believed Black Americans might not even make it to. The rivalry between DuBois and Washington would continue for years. They would never directly debate, but instead would address each other directly and indirectly through publishings, writings, and speeches. Their opposing philosophies would go on to define the clashing views within the civil rights movement. Malcolm X advocated for Black folk to save themselves by any means necessary, a disciple of Booker T. Washington. Martin Luther King Jr., an advocate for integration and civil rights, a student of DuBois. The talented 10th. The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. DuBois advocated for the development of a talented 10th, the top 10% of Black Americans who, through higher education and leadership, would uplift the entire race. This ideology stemmed from the advancements DuBois was able to make through his exceptional intelligence. From an early age, it was DuBois' intellectual skills that granted him access. He was such an exceptional student that white neighbors put money toward DuBois' higher education. It was his supreme intelligence that took him from Fisk to becoming the first Black PhD recipient at Harvard. So it was his belief that if the Black community could assemble just 10% of their most exceptional minds, they would lead their people to prosperity. He argued that producing intellectual, political, and social leaders was essential for challenging systemic oppression and ensuring Black Americans' advancement and empowerment. Education and work are the levers to uplift the people. DuBois believed through education, in particular liberal arts, leaders would be cultivated and prepared to lead and fight for social justice and civil rights. While he agreed vocational training had some value, he believed the only way Blacks could compete in the long run was to have access to the same intellectual and educational opportunities as whites. On freedom and justice. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. Throughout his book, DuBois continues to reiterate the simplicity of the demands of Black folk, his vision of a society that allows Black men and women to exist and enjoy their citizenry and humanity in peace. He didn't think it was fair for Blacks to have to choose allegiance to their race or loyalty to their country. DuBois believed there was space for both, and it could be achieved through access to higher education, political rights, and civil rights. DuBois stated, "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter round it, They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, "How does it feel to be a problem?" they say, "I know an excellent colored man in my town." This powerful statement continues to explore the identity issues blacks faced and continue to face till this day. This concept reveals the psychological toll of alienation and patronizing curiosity. We've all heard it before. "You're beautiful for a black girl," or "You're not like the rest of them." These challenging landscapes create obstacles that force Black Americans to remain dignified in the face of ignorance disguised as empathy. DuBois was a victim of that thinking because of his intelligence and fair skin. Legacy. These are just some of the focal points of this groundbreaking book, and we encourage you to read it and comment on your takeaways. W.E.B. DuBois' work continued after publishing The Souls of Black Folks for another 60 years. DuBois helped create multiple organizations to hammer home the philosophies he laid out. In 1905, he founded the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement directly called for full civil rights, political representation, and an end to racial discrimination. The Niagara Movement directly led to the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, aka the NAACP, in 1909. The NAACP became a major force in the fight for civil rights, advocating for legal challenges to segregation and disenfranchisement, and DuBois served as one of the original chairmen. The book inspired subsequent generations of civil rights activists and intellectuals. DuBois' call for self-determination and advocacy for social justice laid the groundwork for future movements, including the Harlem Renaissance and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The Souls of Black Folk reflects W.E.B. DuBois' belief that achieving equality requires both a recognition of systemic injustices and a commitment to a higher vision for Black life. His work speaks to the resilience and potential of the Black community, advocating for education, political action, and unity as pathways to liberation. It remains a vital work that continues to inspire and inform discussions about race and equality, more than 100 years after it was published. The works of DuBois continue to be used in classrooms and universities all over the world, and we encourage you to check out The Souls of Black Folk and any other literature from one of the greatest minds America has ever produced.